Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown live stream version. I'm Katie Nichols. I'm a certified instructor for SANS, as well as Director of Intelligence at Red Canary. Super excited to be here with you for this month's live stream, and I am very fortunate to be joined this month by Grace Chi. She is the co-founder and COO at PulseDive. Grace, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me on.
Do you want to start by just sharing a little bit about your background, where you come from, how you got into this field of cyber threat intel?
Oh yeah, that's a fun one. So as Katie mentioned, I'm co-founder and COO at PulseDive. PulseDive is a U.S. threat intelligence startup with a community-driven approach to supporting threat intel collection, research, analysis, and automation. However, I did not come from a traditional feeder role into CTI, and therefore I do not work in a traditional CTI capacity. My previous life was basically just chasing things I was interested in, even if they made no sense to anyone else. And I still do that today. So I went from art history and neuroscience, moving towards product marketing. And that's where I really loved bridging different disciplines and technical, non-technical core teams and being able to effectively communicate to drive things forward. And so that paired with never being stuck in just one team or on one project brought me to security over the years. And I've been loving it ever since.
Nice. And it's so funny. I feel like everyone who we ask about their background are like, I'm not a traditional, computer science person, but so many different backgrounds. So that's really cool.
And the traditional security or computer science backgrounds, if you dig hard enough, they have some very untraditional things they've done as well. You just have to ask.
I love that perspective. Awesome. Well, we got stuff joining us from all over. We got George from Salt Lake City, Utah. Grace, I think you and I are both on the East Coast, right?
Yep.
Awesome. Well, I brought Grace in today. Been trying to get her on the show for a couple months now. She did some awesome research a couple months ago that she presented at SANS CTI Summit on CTI, cyber threat intelligence networking and information sharing. And I wanted to deep dive into this with Grace because this is a topic that I feel like everyone just kind of takes for granted. I joke information sharing is like the thoughts and prayers of cybersecurity. Like in policy, you're like, let's just add information sharing. But in how we actually do that and how do we network as a community, how is that useful or not? Those are areas that no one really talks about. So Grace, could you tell me a little bit about, what made you decide to research this area and put the time in, and kind of how did you go about doing that?
So structurally with the report itself, it was when I knew that the CFPs for the CTI Summit were due. So that was the kind of kick in the pants to get me really working on it and, building out the survey, knowing that I was going to write this report. But it was really a marination over the year or two of working in the CTI space and with the community at large that really there was a steady beat of the drum, right? Everyone agrees. If you disagree, let us know in the chat why, but intelligence teams cannot operate in a silo. You hear this in so many different ways with so many different pain points, but the industry that I was looking at from this fresh perspective is so vendor driven, and that's not a bad thing. We both come from vendors. We know that it's critical and it's important in driving the conversation forward, but then a lot of that focus is, and the conversations about sharing is put onto tools, solutions, specific vendors or technical standards. And they are all really important, but the stuff that is in between, the human piece, the relationship piece gets lost and becomes this kind of once you're already far enough, you learn about it and you know about it. And so as an outsider, I just thought in the interpersonal sense, there was a lot that wasn't being transparent, that wasn't being shared, that wasn't being optimized, that wasn't even being benchmarked in any way. So I dug in and I was doing research, and there's a lot about policy, like you said. There's a lot of top line information about strategic awareness or information sharing. How does that actually happen? And then I even found some crazy academic papers about these are the algorithms to measure the trustworthiness of different organizations and individuals in a group that weren't very practical, but theoretically were really interesting. So really at the end of the day, I was like, what's going on? If somebody comes to me and saying, what should I do? Or what's working? I don't know. It's purely anecdotal. So all of this is to say, I saw this happening. No one was really talking about it or doing research on it. Well, this chimes well with my background. Let's go for it and see what happens.
Nice. Nice. So the team on the back end, you can bring this up in your browser and follow along, right? If you just Google Grace Chi CTI networking report, we'll drop a link into the chat for you. So well, can you talk a little bit about your methodology here, right? Like this is such a tough area because there's so much like people just chat about, and like, how did you go about trying to measure this or get people to give you some kind of data?
Yeah. The one great thing about the CTI community, at least from my experience, is that overwhelmingly people are willing to share. If they think that it will be something that is ungated and brought back to the community, the attitudes are really generally positive and helpful. So it goes to when you start networking as well. A disclaimer, though, is that this report, it had 140 or so respondents. It's fully bootstrapped, fully grassroots, no budget. So it did come from my network and the network of network. Therefore, there are biases, and it is by no means like fully empirical, statistically significant. It was that first stab at having the conversation. So structurally, it was how can we do this pretty cheap and really efficiently? So we went with good old Google Forms. It was distributed through social media, some targeted messages, people who had large audiences I had also reached out to. And I was able to get a good responding group of plenty of people that I also didn't know, which helped validate that it went a little bit further than I was fearing it would.
Nice. I think it's important, right? Hey, maybe this isn't thousands of respondents or, scientifically valid, but it's a starting point, right? It's more than we had before. So I'm curious, as you started reading the results or looking at the results, what
Right.
were what kind of surprised you? What was kind of interesting to you in the results? Did anything surprise you in the responses?
One thing that was really interesting to see is that the crowd wisdom, the things that people argue about but have a consensus over on like Twitter or just like on random threads, mostly held true. So the professionals with 5 to 10 years of experience, well established in the CTI space, mostly read it and came back. They're like, okay, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. It's really nice to see the numbers, but this is how I generally feel as well. No one yet, though I encourage you, if you disagree, to came out and said, like, this is super wrong. This makes no sense. This is not my experience. Or this is not what I see as the general experience. Another piece that is not so much related to CTI networking, but that gave me the warm and fuzzies was that the field and the respondents were very highly satisfied with their jobs. I think over 70%. I think, Katie, I don't know if you can jump to slides. I think I have it here. It's at 30. It's all the way at slide 30.
I'll scroll down.
Right.
You can start speaking to it. I'll get there.
There may be a play of self-selection.
Right.
Like you're seeing the survey and you want to respond. That means that you're naturally inclined to feel positively about what you're doing, but people are really happy. And that's something I come across every day too. They are satisfied or highly satisfied, and less than 10% are unsatisfied. And so that was a piece of the response in which made me feel good. And also I was like, I can use this to recruit more people into the CTI space.
I love that. We have a lot of happy people.
Everyone can feel free to use that.
Nice.
A lot of happy campers, though, warning sign here overall. It seems like there's a dip in satisfaction when you get to organizations that are 10,000 to 100,000 large. So there's some pain points, growing points for CTI programs there.
That's fair. Cool. So taking a look at some of the insights, right? Talking about this one-to-one and trust groups. Can you explain for people who are maybe newer to this space, like what are trust groups? Like what is this concept and why do you think people are so interested in them?
Right. So trust groups and one-to-one is easy. In the traditional method is either emails, chats, just direct between two people. And trust groups on the other side are invite only but free peer-to-peer groups that can be structured around Slack or Discord, any sort of mechanism in which people join and then create focused conversations around topics of interest. A lot of times, the vast majority are not publicly announced anywhere, so you kind of only find out about them after you've been embedded in that area for a while.
Yeah, the kind of the Fight Club type methodology, right? And this is something that, I've learned as I've been in this field for years is that, after you get to know people, right, you will sometimes find out about these trust groups. I found a lot of times you have to kind of vouch for new people who are joining, right? So if, Grace and I have worked together, hey, we've shared information in the past. I say, cool, I'll vouch for Grace that she's a reliable person, right? She's going to treat information carefully. So I'm curious, in any insights, what did you hear from people about like why these were so useful to them in sharing, or what did they find so useful about these groups?
So in the survey methodology, one was asking, hey, what methods do you participate in? Trust groups was one-to-one was another. Social media was the kind of third runner up, as well as paid industry groups, dark web, events, and volunteering. What we saw with trust groups is that both one-to-one and trust groups are the result of having built trust. You cannot go from 0 to 1. And by 0 to 1, I mean like you start and you're like, well, I want to be in trust groups, and therefore you get added to trust groups. So after, for better or for worse, after you go through certain filtering and you've attached your trust to other people who are willing to put their reputation on the line for you because of what value they think you will bring, that's where you get into these more hidden or more focused groups that become like curated communities that are providing expert commentary on all the news and all the things that are happening. And I think one thing that was important to me is they won out by far. They were measured more highly in terms of level of participation, in terms of perceived quality on things like timeliness, relevance, confidence of that information they were getting. And they also ranked the most highly in terms of, well, what real world results happened? Did your participation in a trust group mean that it helped you detect an attack, prevent an attack, work through remediation post an attack? So that was kind of preparing both sides. Yeah. And if you dive in deeper to keep going down, I think 2 more slides on maybe 19 or so. It's a little hard to read, but this is the full metric in comparison of the different channels as well as how they ranked. Yeah, so participation, values, perceived value, and then below is the real world results, the proxy for real world results. And so, Katie, the question for you here too is, do you remember the first time you were added to like your first trust group?
It was scary, right? It was scary. I was intimidated, and I felt a lot of pressure because one of my former coworkers had vouched for me, right? They're like, hey, I'd like to get you added. In my case, it was an email distribution list, and they said, hey, it's like a bunch of people, like big names in the industry, and I was added, and I felt a lot of pressure to not say anything stupid. How about you? Do you remember your first time being added?
Yeah. So coming from a different field, I never knew about trust groups in this way. I think there were bits and pieces, but then suddenly, I was being added, I guess, due to my position or what I was working on. And I was terrified. I didn't want to say anything stupid. I definitely didn't feel like I had that traditional background or that I could control. So I lurked a lot. But the good thing about trust groups is they exist in all sizes. They're usually started grassroots by a bunch of people who like working together, and then that grows from there. And they have different, areas of specialties. So you can find the one that you are comfortable in and can contribute to, and then have that expand or bring you into other spaces as you're kind of, kicking off your training wheels.
So given that, right, results, value, pretty clear, as even though your survey was limited, people find these groups valuable. What advice do you have for someone who is maybe newer to the field, who's just listening in, just getting into CTI, and they're like, I want to be part of those trust groups? Like, how do they go from zero to being part of this community and these closed groups? How do they do that?
Right. So one of the findings we had was that the free, open, or free, unpaid, untethered groups that are related to just your own work as an individual in the space were the ones that were most highly ranked. To do that, though, you need to feed yourself into those situations where you meet others that may already be part of this group or part of groups that you aren't aware of. That's where the more public and open components come into play. So events, volunteering, social media, they all have roles and a lot of value in other aspects of a security professional's life, but that's where you start to connect with people outside of just simply your workplace. From there, one of the personas that really responded to the survey were people who had 1 to 3 years of experience, either just starting in a CTI role or they're in incident response, they're in SecOps, but CTI is kind of a little hat they wear on the side. And they felt like they don't do enough CTI to be able to put anything back, but they want to be networked, right? So the desire's there, but there's also a fear where I'm not doing enough novel research. I'm not contributing in a way that I can really kickstart this conversation. And the feedback I got and I saw in some of these responses was to start there. If, let's say, at your job, you feel like all you're doing, and I put that in quotes because you're doing a lot more than that, is reading a bunch of reports, right? You're just trying to keep up with all the threat reports that happen every week. Well, if you're reading the reports and something is great, or you have a follow-up question and the author or the researcher is named, reach out, have a conversation. They love getting feedback from people and helping improve their research. Feedback is a critical component of CTI. So that applies in also distributing reports when the audience is the public or the CTI, community at large. And if you're not comfortable with that, just do some research on that person's history on their Twitter or social and see how they responded. If they embraced it, then it can, encourage you to reach out. So that's one piece. Another piece is a lot of individuals who are starting out feel this pressure to do something big, something completely new, and that's terrifying, and it's not aligned with what they're currently working on. So part of it is stepping back and saying, okay, I'm producing these reports or I'm doing this research that's TLP white. How do I transform that and then just reshare and adaptively reuse all the work and all the knowledge that I'm taking in and make a GitHub repo? Security people love lists. Make a blog. Start having one-to-one coffee conversations with a colleague, and really go with the things that are really close to you that you just need a little bit of effort to transform into something useful. And don't be intimidated by doing that massive, huge project that's super buzzy, because that also is a larger risk for you. So, it's thinking about managing risk as you're starting to build your network out.
I love all of those recommendations. I think these are really actionable things. Like on the volunteering side, there are B-sides conferences worldwide. So like getting involved with the local B-sides volunteering. I know friends who have made a lot of connections that way. I love that, people who are putting work out there love to hear back. And so something as simple as telling an author, hey, I really found your blog post useful. We applied it in an incident I was working, right? That happened to my team last week. And the people who responded, I was like, oh my gosh, that's so nice to hear. Like they took a moment to tell us that they liked the work that my team did. So I think that's a great one. The other one I love is the idea of like creating your own lists or like not having to reinvent the wheel. I was thinking of awesome threat intelligence. I don't know if this is one you've seen, Grace, on GitHub. Like, I don't know who H. Saltman is, but I love this list. They just brought together, right? Being a curator of knowledge is a really powerful role in this community. So this is one I recommend to people all the time. They just took the time to like compile a whole bunch of different CTI resources that are awesome. So I think that that's a great point. Like you don't have to go out and like discover some new APT group. Like just commenting, sharing with others things that you found. I think that's great advice, Grace.
And I think the one other piece is that, remember, it's not transactional. It's not like, "Oh, I'm gonna do this one thing, and then I will be added, and then they will give me all the credit," right? I will get all the karma. And the spirit of the community is not like that. Therefore, you have to go in genuinely, because people will be able to tell, when you're being, superficial in a way. And so when you take that into account, and then you take in your own objectives and what your organization needs you to do, you can be very strategic and very careful about where you're putting this very limited time that you have.
So there's kind of a tough topic with the trust groups that I think it's important to bring up though, right? And it's this idea of being exclusive, right? And by the very nature, they're not inclusive. And so I'm curious, Grace, your thoughts. Like, this is a tough subject, but the reality of these groups is sometimes, and I'll include myself in this, right? Because I've been in for a few years, there's this risk of only including people who look or act or had the same background as me. Um, and I'm wondering your thoughts on that. And maybe what can those of us who are in these groups do better to be more inclusive?
I think the really interesting balance that I was having conversations about is a trust group. And you can be in, well, Katie, let me ask, how many different trust groups are you in, or how many different channels are you in? And then also, what subset of those are like you're actively contributing to versus, sometimes you lurk and you close out the notifications every once a month.
Probably like 10 to 20. And I actively contribute to maybe like two because it takes time.
Yeah. And I think that ties really closely to being strategic. Like, don't stretch yourself too thin, trying to get added and then staying up to date with all these things. The ones that are giving you impact, that have the people having conversations that really matter to what you're looking at, what you're researching, stick with those. There's going to be more and more and more. As far as exclusivity, the challenge is in finding and striking that balance between staying focused, right? Having a shared objective, having the right level of like expertise or commentary that provides success, right, for that trust group,
Mhm.
but then also being an echo chamber and limiting your perspective. So, like, theoretically, the point is understanding what you're trying to achieve within that trust group. It's knowing that we care about malware analysis, or that we're tracking geopolitical threat intelligence, but not limiting that to the types of people or the types of experiences, uh, when you're advocating. Saying that, well, is there somebody who has a slightly different background who can translate across 5 different languages? Is there somebody who had a really unique take in a slightly different way that could be applied? And so understanding that just because you might have a really niche area of conversation or multiple channels, that doesn't mean you need those niche specialists that all look and sound the same.
Yeah, I think those are good things to keep in mind, right? Like having a topic, a focus area, realizing a lot of people could contribute. Another thing I wanted to call out is people who kind of own these trust groups. Usually they have like some kind of moderator, administrator. I think they have a role as well. And I've talked to a couple people in this role. I'd challenge those people if any of them are listening, right? Realize you have an important role in being inclusive and consider, even if you're not a moderator, if you're just an experienced an original member of one of these groups, bringing in new people and highlighting them. So maybe like I'm like, hey, Grace would add value to this group I'm part of. I invite Grace, and then maybe we're talking about hey, threat intelligence platforms, and I'm like, hey, Grace, you are co-founder, COO of Pulse Dive, like, do you have perspective here? Like inviting them into the conversation, because I think Dan commented earlier, like trust groups are definitely intimidating. And so I think that like those who are already in them, I think play an important role bringing others in and kind of highlighting, hey, do you have something to say here? Or there's one person in one group I'm in a Slack who does something as simple as whenever someone posts something, they'll just give like a thumbs up or like a thank you emoji. Something as simple as an emoji can make people feel like, hey, someone saw this, someone sees me, I'm part of this group. And I think it can go a long way to kind of decreasing the intimidation and the imposter syndrome that, we all feel like, do I belong here in these smart people?
Or exactly, like, there is no no one's saying anything or doing anything, but you're just too scared to jump in. And the conversations are just basically thread tweet storms essentially going on. And if you say something and you might feel stupid, you don't know who everyone is. It can be really scary. And I think one other piece here is, even if you're not a moderator, but you know people who are, empower them, send good people their way, tell them they're doing well, because there's no governance on threat groups. Like, Katie, I'm sure you and I are in the same boat where you've been parts of ones that are not good. And they might be small, they might be really big, but you kind of vote with your support on who you contribute to and where you're putting your own efforts. So you can guarantee or help the success of the groups that you're seeing a lot of inclusivity and really good work coming out of.
Absolutely. So we talked a lot about trust groups. Let's talk a little bit about social media, because this one, right? Don't underestimate social media. Made an outsized impact on results compared to other methods. What advice do you have for people on social media? Because it can be a dumpster fire, to put it kindly. What do you think? How can people get a lot of value out of social media?
I saw a funny tweet the other day that was like, everyone on Twitter loves hating Twitter and they won't get off of it. And I think sometimes it's just true. But the reality is that there's so much good security research and news and updates happening through Twitter. People said it was by far extremely timely, but it's also super noisy. So if you scroll just up a little bit, you'll see where the difference in value for social media, which is that third chunk, versus the results
Mm-hmm.
experienced from participating in social media are in the chart underneath. So you can see that there's like no confidence. It's, super timely, but it's really noisy. Social media is confusing because there's the personal aspect of, I want everyone to know what song I'm listening to the personal brand building, professional of, I'm sharing this cool blog I wrote about threat intelligence, to tracking news. So you have to be really thoughtful about what you're trying to do with social media. If you want to just consume, you want to ingest IOCs, you want to ingest the latest news about the wiper, the locker, pick whatever strain and exploits coming out, then really learn how to do advanced muting, make sure you're following the right researchers, and then lurk away. That might not mean people are coming to you, but that is the utility you're looking for. If you are trying to start networking and building your reputation, but it comes with risks. I've known many people who have been very successful staying pretty anonymous. Once you get comfortable, you might one-on-one know individuals and they'll vouch for you, but you can leave an avatar up and be completely anonymized, no gender, no location, anything, until you're at the point that you feel you're comfortable putting your identity out there.
Yeah, and George commenting, they like to use Tweetdeck to help narrow things down on Twitter. Tweetdeck, great recommendation. It can still be really noisy. I would +1 what Grace said about muting. There's definitely a lot of negativity on social media, and if someone is just a negative force or they're like saying things that are not helpful, like just mute them. They will never know, and then your timeline is much more happy. So that's something I do a lot. The other thing I'd suggest for getting started in social media, if you're at a conference that has hashtags. My example, I got my start in social media. I was just a lurker, as Grace said, for years, right? I was supporting government and I was like, oh, this is scary. I don't want anyone to know who I am. So I was really quiet, which is a great use of social media. But at the SANS CTI summit, the first one I attended years ago, I started like tweeting interesting things from the talks with the hashtag CTI summit. And I started fangirling because Rick Holland replied to one of my tweets. And I was like, oh my gosh. And like I had a little back and forth. I think that's a great way, like using conference, hashtags, or if someone tweets out a blog post, just replying, with a nice comment or a question. I still have Twitter friends that I've never actually met in real life, people who are just constructive and kind. I know people can be kind on social media. So just interacting and, being respectful and professional and kind, I think will get you a long way on social media, honestly.
Yeah. And I think that was one of I have to find which slide. I think it was on page 24. There's a break from all of the data, and I had collected like advice by and for the community. So I had open-ended responses. This was totally optional, and I had like 20 pages of single space responses. It was amazing. And this is where I think, as you were mentioning, Katie, being trustworthy and building trust is important. And there's kindness. I think the algorithms like to, foment a lot of argument and controversy, but at the end of the day, the CTI community is extremely positive, is extremely encouraging. And so being able to take those moments that you're comfortable contributing and then holding yourself to really high professional standards, knowing that this is related to your work and to yourself as a professional in the space, is really important. But at the same time, do your due diligence and be a good analyst, even when you're doing social media. Make sure your sources are reputable. Make sure you've done your research, just to make sure that you're not missing out on something, because social media can be timely and people can get corralled into entirely wrong tunnels of thought, just because it's newsy.
Absolutely. I love this. This is like a great one pager, right? What should you do? Participate, build trust, stay careful, be strategic. As we're trying to wrap up, Grace, what else? What haven't we talked about from this research about networking, about sharing that we should talk about?
When I was reaching out, I didn't know exactly who would respond, but what happened was a pretty solid respondent rate of like 50% were mostly CTI primary job responsibility, and then a smattering of expected roles coming from other, like incident response, leadership, threat hunting, a couple GRC and red team, which was really exciting to see.
Nice.
One thing that was fun is no matter what, everyone was interested in actionable outcomes. Not a surprise in the intel space. But what types of information, from the raw data to contextualized information to process intelligence, varied a lot. And so when you are networking with people that have different primary responsibilities, you can also understand that, for example, incident responders highly rated getting raw data, and they actually put process intelligence further down. Let me try to see. I put a note on which slide. I think it might have been somewhere in the, go to page 22.
So many great slides.
There's a lot of pages in there.
Oh yeah, I love this one. Like thinking about the different types of information, right? There's raw data, technical, emotion. I like emotional support because sometimes we all need that, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because so like incident response, raw data is number one. Security operations, they have a lot of trauma from noisiness and alerts, and they don't want raw data. So when you're interacting and you're building out these teams, trust groups, you're talking to different people in the space, you can also think, what value can I bring to you, and what roles or what groups might this person be actually great for based on the content that's already being delivered in these spaces. The emotional support I put in because people, when I was doing the initial research, emotional and technical support were categories of information that were useful. It just ultimately was not part of those top priorities. And I think for those with 1 to 5 years of experience, the advice of others were like, number two, because they're just getting started. So if you know somebody is starting out and they're in these groups or you're networking with them, they are valuing that a little bit more highly.
That's really interesting. I'm gonna have to go back and think about what value do I get. Like I like all of these on different days, and some days I need emotional support when it's been a long day, right? So that's really interesting. And I think this kind of, jives with an overall, goal by a CTI analyst to think about requirements and, right, what are you trying to get out of something? How can you serve your consumers? So different requirements for different types of sharing, I think, is my takeaway from this information.
Absolutely. And I think the last piece in which I wanted to push further, but I had only started to scratch the surface of in this report, is how do you tie organizational requirements to individuals going out and networking? Right now, it's totally an afterthought, right? Everyone, it's great, go network, it's awesome, but leadership is not necessarily encouraging that outright. It's kind of, sure, things might be happening, but there's no visibility, there's no discourse tying those top line metrics of awareness, timeliness, networking, to these items that a lot of people are doing, but kind of just get absorbed into the person's work.
Yeah. Actually a great point and brings up something we haven't talked about, but I think it's kind of important. The risks of doing information sharing, right? Like it's all well and nice, right? It's a force multiplier. You can help your organization, which I absolutely agree. But there's a risk to this, right? Like if I share something and then someone scoops me and publishes first, or I say it's TLP red, only the people in the conversation can use it, and then someone shares it with a reporter. Like what is that something you looked at all into, Grace? What would you advise on like balancing that risk?
Right. So there is now, I don't have this page number off the top of my head. It must be around the 30s, but there were challenges. I looked at challenges within organizations and individuals. Let's see. Right. Oh, I got it. And the top challenge was no time. So everyone's busy. That's really not a surprise. The open-ended answers, you had time, 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 time in the response. But then
Oh,
you'll see at the bottom, the third and fourth was about liability, confidentiality, and sharing restrictions. The inability put by either external or your own forces to not share information. And what we found was that most people abided by policies set by the company. They weren't going out and sharing things they weren't supposed to.
mhm.
But it is a question of personal risk. That's security. You're managing your own risk. So you should be very intentional about understanding the risk of you putting something out there that maybe, you're not barred from saying it, but it might put you at a disadvantage or somebody might take it. And then being able to accept that level of risk based on the outcome you're looking for. The other piece is that trust groups, from my experience at least, take TLP and take trust and reputation very seriously. I have seen groups remove people because they've been aware of an individual that was added that had misbehaved in the past based on TLP. And so that is, if you are one of those people wanting to kind of play hard and fast, understand that may jeopardize your standing in the community as well.
For those who aren't familiar, when we say TLP, traffic light protocol, so it just describes how far you can share information, right? So anything on this live stream is TLP white. It's publicly available, but there are different levels of sharing. Um, and yeah, I think that's a challenge, when you have policies. But what I found is really useful is talking to your leadership, and this is somewhat of an educational piece, right? And sometimes you'll have to kind of build the case for doing information sharing, right? Maybe you ask your boss's permission. Hey, can I share information about the hash value of this attachment to a phishing email, right? And then get approval to share something small, and then maybe show benefit. Hey, I shared this hash value with a friend I know from another org. They were able to tell me that was Emotet, right? So starting to kind of build confidence, but I think we should, point out like I'll follow your team, your company policy, talk to your leadership and get buy-in before going rogue.
Don't go rogue.
We'll accept personal risk, right? But my recommendation is talk to your leadership, explain to them why information sharing is important, and kind of bring them along with that idea.
And I think the important piece here is understanding, it might be on the following slide if you scroll down, that being able to start to showcase some of the impact you've already made through networking in completely sanctioned ways that you're allowed to do that, and saying that this was because I was part of certain groups. Understanding that your team is supportive of this, don't get in trouble for what I'm telling you, but being able to then tie that back to top level and being rewarded, being incentivized for participating by actively contributing and being able to retrieve useful, valuable intelligence as well out of these groups. That's where I think there's a lot of room to shine, just being aware and acknowledging what's taking place and then being able to optimize from there.
Yeah, so I think for anyone on the leadership side, right, I think there's a lot of work to do as leaders in security operations, understanding this and figuring out what's the right risk, and then right rewarding people who take the time to do this. Because as you noted in challenges, it's time consuming to try to maintain a relationship and follow up and remember to share information and then, maintain these relationships.
Definitely. And if it's not worth your time, don't do it. But there are pieces, and understand that like it's still somewhat manual. It's not the most efficient. There's no great solves all tool to help you with all the things, the benefits you want from networking. But at the end of the day, a lot of senior leadership and senior practitioners are doing this. There has to be a reason. It might be like 2% because of emotional support, but there's a lot of actionable takeaways, concrete outcomes that are coming from participation in these groups.
Excellent. Well, anything else we should talk about, Grace? I feel like we've discussed so much today.
I would say my ask for anyone in a leadership role is, even if you don't want to get started with the point of adding to trust groups, vouching for people, is just help connect colleagues. If you have team members on your team, you know another leader that has interesting and really talented team members, and you're comfortable with that, you can facilitate those relationships that you are already in support of. A lot of the open-ended questions said, hey, if I had support from leadership, that would have been a game changer. It would have saved us so much time when we were working through Log4j or, Spring4 Shell. Another one was like, oh, I had a manager who would just introduce us to people. And that made a huge difference in all of our personal, professional development. So you can be person as well. You can be an enabler as well. And that's something that scales up and down. If you're busy, you don't have to, but when you have a moment, when it comes to mind, do that and help nurture that community.
Nice. I think that's a great note to end on, right? All about connecting with others, right? And you can be a facilitator of that regardless of where you are. And just to highlight, I think we've given a lot of actionable guidance here today, right? Information sharing, networking is so important, whether it's social media, through volunteering, through writing your own blogs. I think we'd both just encourage everyone to get out there and connect with people, because I think we can all win together, right? It's a little cheesy, but excellent.
Really good. And let the author know that they did a good job.
Yes.
That's everyone's homework.
Love it. Well, Grace, thank you so much for joining today. Really appreciate your time. And yes, we've dropped the report link. So if you enjoy the report, the research Grace did, please reach out to her. I think you're on LinkedIn as well as Twitter. So Grace, thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you for having me, Katie.
Take care. Excellent. Well, great discussion with Grace there. Information sharing, networking, something that I think is really under-discussed in this field, which is why I really wanted to have Grace on to talk through that. So now let's move on. And as we do every month, let's talk about some thready threat things. I will share all of these links after the live stream, so you can just kind of listen and think for now, but I promise I will share all of these later on. So let's talk through some key things that have been trending throughout the past couple weeks. The first one, got to talk about ransomware. As always, lots going on in that space. The question that I keep getting is ransomware getting better? My answer, it's really boring, is no one knows. I don't know. If you've tuned into the live stream before, you'll know that one of the things that I think is really tough about the ransomware landscape is no one has perfect visibility. So one thing I wanted to highlight is this kind of tracking, Ransomware Tracker from the Record, right? Publication from Recorded Future. All data is imperfect on ransomware, but what they do is they track the number of victims reported on these data leak sites. So a lot of ransomware groups, right, they will do this double extortion. They will steal information, then they will post it to these leak sites, often on dark web sites. And so the Record tracks, okay, how many victims have had their data released on these sites over months. Again, this is imperfect, but if nothing else, this shows us that yes, ransomware still is hanging around. You might see, right, from January through April. Okay, January was kind of a lighter month, in like 150-ish, right? 300-ish victims in April last month. Tough to say if it's getting better or not. But I think what we can say is there is still very impactful ransomware incidents. One that I wanted to highlight that was really interesting, right? The Conti ransomware attack against the Costa Rican government. When we talk about real world impact of ransomware, here is one, right? The Costa Rican government declaring a national emergency because of a ransomware attack from Conti. So this is a really interesting case to follow, in part because of the national emergency perspective. But Brett Callow, who's a great person on Twitter to follow about ransomware tidbits, right? Saying that reportedly, and these are kind of unconfirmed, there might have been people in Costa Rica who were collaborating with cyber criminals from the Conti group. Kind of interesting, this idea that potentially there was an insider-enabled attack, which is something that I think a lot of cybersecurity analysts hypothesize about, but it's rare that we see anything. So again, unconfirmed, but I think this attack against the Costa Rican government is really worth watching. Again, because there's this idea, people are like, oh, ransomware isn't as bad because, in the US, we haven't had huge gas prices due to a ransomware attack on a pipeline for months. I think there are some indications that maybe it's letting up a little bit, but this is an example that there are really impactful ransomware incidents right now. Conti, that group is extremely busy right now, one of the most prevalent groups right now. And so, I don't think to me, the question isn't always, do we have an absolute measure of how good or bad ransomware is, how many exact cases? It's still a threat to many organizations, in my opinion. So what should you be doing? What should you be looking for? Really awesome blog post from the team at Microsoft talking about the ransomware as a service ecosystem. I am guilty of this myself. I will often say Conti group, right? And just kind of hand wave. But I really like this graphic they have on the affiliate model. This is something, if you've tuned in before to the live stream, I talk about a lot, right? There are a lot of initial access malware families, things like TrickBot or Iced ID or QBot. And often those are under the control of an initial access broker. Then they'll hand off access to this ransomware as a service affiliate, right? Who's often the person who's going to move laterally between systems. They exfil their data, they run the ransomware payload, but that affiliate in the middle is actually working with like the developer of the ransomware on the back end. And so it's really tough, and I'm guilty of it as well, right? Conti group. Have to understand that even if we say Conti group, there are different parts of this. And I think that honestly, that kind of handoff can make it more confusing as analysts try to track, okay, what leads to what? So always be thinking about, okay, those initial access brokers, as I've said time and time again, are often the ones who are deploying this boring old crimeware like QBot that might end up in a ransomware intrusion later on. So this one is a detailed piece of work. Hats off to the Microsoft folks involved in here, right? They talk about a lot of techniques, then they have deep dives into all of these different groups involved in ransomware, right? Microsoft uses the dev designator for, I believe it's kind of groups that they haven't yet attributed formally to a country. So Dev 193, which is TrickBot LLC, other groups giving the background there. And they have a ton of awesome guidance down here, right? We often give a hand wavy guidance like improve your credential hygiene. Well, they have really, really detailed guidance here on how to actually do that. So again, this is one, I'll share the link out later on. Keep an eye out on my Twitter. We'll share out this link, but if you are trying to protect against ransomware, a lot of really actionable guidance in here. So I mentioned this concept, right? Ransomware as a service. There are ransomware developers behind the keyboard. And a great source for understanding this just came out this week in the form of an indictment from the US Department of Justice. So this one was pretty fascinating because the complaint was against a ransomware developer who was located in Venezuela and apparently was a doctor and just decided to do ransomware on the side. This is a fascinating one. But what was interesting about this is as you read the kind of the press release and then the indictment, the complaint behind it, you can get kind of insight into this whole ecosystem of ransomware and the developers versus the affiliates, right? So this doctor, who's a 55-year-old cardiologist, developed ransomware tools, including, I think it was Thanos, and then also one called Jigsaw. You can see here in the press release, right? This is what the user interface looked like, right? He would sell this Thanos ransomware tool to anyone who would pay for it, right? And so gives you a sense of what it's like to be maybe on the adversary side. Um, Things like, okay, I just click the obfuscation button and it obfuscates for me. That's kind of nice. So very interesting reading. This is the full complaint, all 20 pages of it, worth a look if you're interested in these kind of documents. Something else I wanted to point out, and credit to Colin on Twitter who pointed this out. These indictments I've mentioned before, right? I keep a list of different indictments. A few colleagues help me keep this updated, but these indictments are such a wealth of information about a bunch of different adversaries. There's a really interesting tidbit in this one that speaks to kind of how governments, how the DOJ starts to piece together these indictments, these complaints, right? So there was this path that appeared in one of the ransomware variants that he developed called Jigsaw, right? This file path, C users moises, however you say that, MOISES. I don't know about you, but like my folder on my machine, right? C users K Nichols, for example. And sometimes as analysts, we'll see this and be like, oh, well, like that can't possibly be their real name. They would definitely change it. Well, in this case, this developer didn't actually change that, right? That was actually their first name. And Colin pointed this out on Twitter. Colin's a great person to follow on Twitter. Someone actually tweeted this out back in 2019. DFN cert found this PDB string, this program database string, in this Jigsaw ransomware variant. So one of the things I talk about in this SANS class I teach quite a bit is looking for human fingerprints, right? Clues that could speak to the human behind the keyboard. This is a really interesting one, right? The username and a path in this file, at the time, right? If you were just looking at this, you might not know what that is, but over time, you can start to piece those little observables together. And eventually this ended up in an indictment. So thanks to Colin for tweeting that out. If there are any adversaries listening, please continue to use your real name in file paths. That's very helpful for defenders and analysts. So that's an interesting read, came out this week in terms of an indictment against a ransomware developer. But just signaling the fact that, hey, US Department of Justice and other countries as well are continuing to try to indict, kind of put pressure against different ransomware developers. George asked a question on ransomware. Do you think we'll continue to see ransomware used for more political reasons? Belarusian cyber partisans holding the railway system hostage. I think it's a really interesting development, George, and it's one that I'm keeping an eye on. I don't have enough data to say if this is a trend that we're definitely going to see. I think it is one that's worth watching, though. I think we've started to see over the past couple of years ransomware kind of change, and with the rise of double extortion, exfiltrating data, I think kind of hacktivist ransomware is something that could be a rising threat. So I don't think we've seen much of it, but definitely worth watching for sure. So that's a little bit of a ransomware roundup, right? We hit that most months. So moving on from ransomware, I titled this section "The Gootz." And credit to my teammate, Mark, who tweeted out this ridiculous Gootz meme. Wanted to call out 2 blog posts, including one from my team, one from the DFIR report on Gootloader or Gootkit. This is one of those malware families that is around quite a bit, but I found that it's not one that a lot of people have heard of. So Gootloader, sometimes people will call the same family Gootkit. Some people split Gootkit out as a separate payload, different ways to do that. But it's kind of an interesting initial access vector through search engine optimization. So looking at, as a user, I am typing in Freddie Mac shared driveway agreements. And maybe in my search results, different search engines, I see, okay, there's a Freddie Mac shared driveway agreement link. I'm going to click that. And often it will download JavaScript. So you see in the timeline here, which we learned last month from talking to Zach from the DFIR report, they create these timelines using Xmind. So for example, if you searched into your search engine for Olympus plea agreement, it would download that JavaScript and then rely on a user to execute it. I think this is an interesting one worth calling out because in a lot of user education, right, people will say, oh yeah, watch out for the suspicious links or attachments. But I don't know that I've ever seen a user awareness training saying, whenever you search for something, watch out what site you click on because it might be highly targeted to your search query. Like that's not as something that I see as often in user education training. So this is an interesting threat to look at from that perspective of the search engine optimization helping with the initial access vector. As usual, DFIR report has an awesome timeline here, right? Describing how, okay, the Goot loader was the initial access, but then the intrusion continued, used a lot of the techniques that we talk about every month. Of course, Cobalt Strike was involved, dumping credentials with Mimikatz, and then eventually stealing, viewing sensitive information and potentially exfiltrating that. So the DFIR report blog on Goot loader. And then my team also put out a blog post on the Goot cause. So same kind of thing, diving into the TTP's explanation of why we divide Goot loader from Goot kit, which some people combine them. Totally legit. So that's a threat that I think it's worth looking at. Again, one of those that I found not a whole lot of people are talking about. So the Gootz, some good reading here for you. On the international relations side, wanted to call out an interesting one that came up last week, I believe. If you'll recall, early in the Ukraine conflict, there was some public reporting about satellites at Viasat, right? Some satellite internet being taken down, various routers being taken down. And this often will happen, right? There's reports of some kind of cyber attack or intrusion, and then weeks or months after the fact, organizations will come out, countries will come out and attribute that to another country. This one was sort of interesting because everyone kind of assumed at the time, right, probably Russia, but we want to watch out for our hindsight bias being at play. A lot of countries have interests in Ukraine in that conflict. But appreciated this roll up from Dan Black on Twitter of all of these different organizations who came out attributing the Viasat satellite internet attack to Russian military intelligence. So it's always interesting when many countries get in the game here, right? UK, Denmark, Norway, Chechnya, right? Germany, Netherlands, Estonia, Australia. Pretty clear message being sent here. And you can even, as you go through and read some of this, right? Talking about how this is unacceptable behavior in cyberspace, right? The Chechnya saying, we call on all states to adhere to standards of responsible behavior in cyberspace, signaling that, hey, according to this international community, this series of countries, taking down satellite internet that supports civilian infrastructure maybe isn't an okay norm to adhere under. So kind of an interesting case study in a bunch of countries coming out and formally attributing activity. One last one I wanted to hit briefly. I don't always highlight stuff from my team, but this one made its rounds on social media in the news. Just kind of an interesting case study. My team put out this blog post on an activity cluster called Raspberry Robin. Some people have asked about the name. We do color plus bird, red canary, because it's kind of fun. And this was interesting because it's this weird USB-based worm that uses Windows installer. It reaches out to infrastructure that seems like it's compromised QNAP devices, QNAP network devices. And this one is strange because my team's been seeing it for a couple months. And a few weeks ago, we started talking to others and realizing other people have maybe seen this too. And this is one, if you have any kind of like endpoint visibility, this might look familiar. So it's kind of worth checking your systems for this one, right? These same kind of command line pattern with a .usb extension, right? Via MSI exec, one of those built-in binaries. It would reach out to these domains that only had a couple of letters, right? We found that this threat also likes to use mixed case, so a mix of upper and lower case characters, which is interesting because maybe they're trying to kind of bypass, if you're just detecting on upper or lower case, bypassing those detections. So this one's kind of curious because we've seen it in a bunch of environments and a bunch of other people have as well, but we don't really know what it's doing, right? It's reaching out to this command and control domain. It seems like it's worming around different networks via USB devices, but we haven't seen it stealing information, doing anything else in that actions on objectives phase. So if you have visibility into this one, right, my team at Red Canary would love to hear from you, but it's kind of an interesting one worth looking for because we've seen it on a lot of different networks around the world. Cool. So it is almost 2 p.m. Eastern time. Time flies when you're having fun. So just a couple SANS notes as we close. The SANS DFIR Summit. This is one of the big summits of the year. It's going to be in person and live online in August. So go ahead, check that out. You can register for that summit totally free. This is the 15th year this summit has been going on. So a lot of fun stuff happening around that. Another free summit, this one just online, the Ransomware Summit. If you want more ransomware content, June 16th through 17th, that one's coming up. And another fun one, I've seen we have folks around the world. If you're in Europe especially, there's a fun conference called Cyber Threat in London in September. And so the call for presentations is open for that one. So lots of fun stuff, summits, both in person and online going on at SANS. With that, we are right at the hour. So want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you all so much for joining this month's edition of the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown live stream. Stay well, and we hope to see you in a future month. Take care, everyone.